On a cold December night in 1987, the town of Carl Junction, Missouri, became the site of one of the most disturbing teen murders in state history. The crime would shake the community, provoke national headlines, and become forever linked to the late 1980s wave of hysteria known as the Satanic Panic. But behind the panic and courtroom transcripts lies a deeply human story, one of vulnerability, peer pressure, and the fragility of adolescence. Carl Junction was a small town with a familiar American shape. Churches lined the quiet streets. Schools hosted football games under floodlights on fall evenings. Everyone seemed to know each other. It was a place where parents still let their children roam free after school and neighbors waved from porches. But even towns like Carl Junction had cracks beneath the surface. The 1980s brought cultural upheaval into even the most secluded places. Music, movies, and new ideologies traveled faster than before. Some teens turned to punk rock, others to metal. Some flirted with the idea of rebellion as a statement. A few took it further. In Carl Junction, 3 teenage boys formed a bond built on alienation, curiosity, and darkness. Their names were James Hardy, Pete Rowland, and Ronald Clements. They would soon become known throughout Missouri for a crime that defied comprehension. Steven Newberry was 19 years old when he was killed. He wasn't known for being particularly outspoken or rebellious. He had not made enemies. His family described him as sensitive, affectionate, and trusting. He wanted friends. He longed to be accepted. That need made him vulnerable, and in Hardy, Rowland, and Clements, he thought he had found people who welcomed him. They were older boys, charismatic in their own way. They stood apart from others with their dark clothing, whispered secrets, and references to occult rituals. They read Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, scribbled pentagrams into notebooks, and fantasized about rebellion in its most absolute form. To most people around them, it was just posturing, an act, a phase. But for Hardy, Rowland, and Clements, it became a worldview. Steven, eager to fit in, followed where they led. They invited him into their circle and asked him to participate in the killing of animals, beginning with stray cats and kittens. He didn't refuse. He may have been horrified, but he stayed. It made him feel like he belonged. He was included in their plans, their games, their conversations. For a young man who often felt left out, that meant something. By October of 1987, the trio had moved beyond fantasy. They discussed killing a person. Not just in abstract terms. They chose a date, Halloween night. They chose a location, a remote area near an abandoned railroad track. And they chose a target, Steven Newberry. Why Steven? Because he trusted them, because he would come if they asked, and because they believed he would not resist. The Halloween plan failed. Steven's mother refused to let him go out that night, perhaps sensing something was wrong. The group postponed the killing but did not abandon it. They waited, they continued to talk, and weeks later, they were ready to try again. On that cold Sunday afternoon, Hardy, Rowland, and Clements picked up Steven under the pretense of another animal sacrifice. They brought baseball bats and a kitten. The 4 boys drove to the woods outside Carl Junction and walked together into the trees, toward the clearing near the old rail line. It was familiar territory. First came the kitten. They beat it to death, each taking part. The act was grotesque, but it was only the beginning. What followed was far worse. Hardy turned to Steven and said, "Let's do something before it gets too dark." Then he swung his bat and struck Steven in the face. Steven screamed. He ran. The others chased him. He tripped and fell. What came next was relentless. Hardy, Rowland, and Clements beat him with their bats. He curled into a fetal position. He begged. They struck him again and again, at least 20 times each. The autopsy would later reveal more than 60 blunt force injuries. When Steven stopped moving, they wrapped his body in twine, tied a large rock to his waist, and dragged him to an abandoned cistern. They dropped him in. His jacket followed. The water swallowed him. He sank without a sound. They cleaned up and agreed to tell anyone who asked that they had dropped Steven off at a convenience store called Barney's. Then they went home. By the next morning, Steven's mother was worried. He had not come home. He had not called. She went to the police and filed a missing person report. The investigation began quickly. Officer Mike Randolph, along with investigators Ray Youngblood and Captain Jim Wiseman, began interviewing classmates. The 3 suspects told their rehearsed story. They said they dropped Steven off. But the story began to unravel almost immediately. Ronald Clements cracked first. He was brought in for questioning on December 7th. He was 17, legally an adult under Missouri law. His mother was present but stepped out at his request. Clements was nervous, pale, and visibly shaken. After being read his Miranda rights, he confessed. His confession was brief but damning. He described the killing in detail. He named Hardy and Rowland. He admitted his role. His statement became known in court as Exhibit 6. Later that night, Clements led police to the murder site. There, officers found blood, signs of struggle, and the cistern. Inside was Steven's body, exactly as described. The next morning, on December 8, Clements gave a second, more detailed confession, Exhibit 9. He confirmed the planning, the killing, and the disposal. Hardy and Rowland were arrested shortly after. All three were charged with first-degree murder, a charge that carried the possibility of life without parole, or even the death penalty. Each was tried separately to allow the evidence and confessions to be considered individually. In all three trials, the defense attorneys raised similar arguments. They spoke of mental illness, childhood trauma, emotional instability, and coercion. They said their clients were not evil, but broken. Clements' lawyers argued he was submissive and terrified. Rowland's team painted a picture of a boy raised in neglect, drawn to darkness as a way to feel in control. Hardy's defense leaned heavily on the idea that he was young and impulsive, not calculating. None of it worked. In Clements' trial, the court ruled that his confessions were voluntary. In State v. Clements, 789 SW2D 101, the judge found that although Clements was nervous and upset during questioning, he understood his rights and spoke freely. His claims of coercion were dismissed. The jury listened to his own words, read the transcript, and found him guilty. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. In State v. Rowland, 808 SW2D 855, similar arguments about mental illness and Satanism were presented. Psychologists described Rowland as deeply disturbed, but the jury saw no justification. He had planned the crime, participated in the beating, and helped conceal the body. He too was found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. Hardy, the last to face trial, entered a guilty plea to avoid the death penalty. His attorneys negotiated a deal that ensured he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The plea acknowledged his central role in the crime. He had initiated the attack and devised the cover-up. His sentence matched the others, life without parole. With the verdicts delivered, the legal system considered the case closed. But for the people of Carl Junction, and for the broader public who had followed the case, the questions were just beginning. Why had three teenagers planned and executed such a horrific act? Were they truly motivated by Satanism, or had they used its imagery to justify their violence? How could a young man like Steven, so eager for friendship, have walked into his own death without realizing it? The answers did not come easily. For years, the case was cited as a prime example of satanic ritual homicide. It was referenced in news segments, academic papers, and books on teenage violence. But as the cultural panic faded, a more complicated picture emerged. One that spoke to mental health, emotional isolation, and the terrifying power of groupthink among adolescents. For over 2 decades, James Hardy, Pete Rowland, and Ronald Clements remained behind bars, each serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The crime they had committed, murdering their classmate Steven Newberry and disposing of his body in a forgotten cistern, was widely regarded as one of the most cold-blooded and senseless acts in Missouri's modern history. Few questioned the severity of their punishment. In the eyes of the court and much of the public, justice had been served. But in 2012, the ground shifted. That year, the United States Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision in Miller v. Alabama. The court ruled that mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional, violating the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The justices did not say that juveniles could never be sentenced to life without parole. Rather, they emphasized that courts must consider a defendant's youth and potential for rehabilitation before imposing the harshest penalties. This ruling opened a legal door. Suddenly, hundreds of juvenile offenders across the country, including Hardy, Rowland, and Clements, were eligible to have their cases reviewed. Missouri, like many states, began to re-examine the sentences of individuals convicted as minors and given automatic life terms. The question was no longer only about what they had done. It was also about who they had become. Ronald Clements was the first to come under serious consideration. During his incarceration, he had maintained a record of good behavior. He had participated in educational programs, enrolled in group therapy, and expressed deep remorse for his actions. Corrections staff described him as cooperative and introspective. He wrote letters to the Newberry family, acknowledging the pain he had caused and accepting responsibility. Parole hearings were convened, victim impact statements were submitted. Experts evaluated his psychological state, his likelihood of reoffending, and his capacity for reintegration. The process was thorough, contentious, and public. Some residents of Carl Junction argued that no amount of rehabilitation could erase the cruelty of the crime. Others believed that if the legal system was evolving, then its changes had to be honored, even in the most difficult cases. After much deliberation, Ronald Clements was granted parole. His release came with strict conditions. He would be monitored, required to attend therapy, prohibited from contacting the victim's family, and confined to a narrow geographic area. The Missouri Department of Corrections implemented a long-term reintegration plan. Still, news of his release hit the town with force. For some, it felt like betrayal. For others, it was a reluctant step forward. Next came Pete Rowland. His background was more complex. His trial had focused on his psychological instability, and his behavior in prison had at times raised concerns. But he too had participated in rehabilitative programs and undergone evaluations. He had not caused disciplinary issues in years. His review was more contentious, but ultimately, he was also approved for parole under supervised release. The most controversial case was that of James Hardy. As the ringleader, Hardy had been viewed as the most responsible and least remorseful. His parole hearings were met with widespread public resistance. Victim advocacy groups became involved. Petition drives were launched. Still, the legal precedent was clear. Hardy, like the others, was entitled to review. His record in prison was mixed. He had not been violent, but he had not expressed remorse in the same public way as the others. Nevertheless, the review board eventually found that he too met the criteria for release. Hardy was paroled, with perhaps the strictest oversight of the three. By the early 2020s, all three of Steven Newberry's killers had been released or were in the final stages of conditional parole. The legal process had followed the Constitution. But emotionally, many were left reeling. Carl Junction had never been a place used to national attention. It was a town shaped by community, family, and faith. The murder had fractured those ideals, and while time had softened the sharpest grief, the return of the case to headlines reopened old wounds. Some residents pushed for compassion. They acknowledged that the boys who committed the crime were now men, and that the justice system, having judged them once, was now bound by fairness to judge them again under new standards. Others pushed back. They did not deny the law, but they questioned whether those who had planned and carried out such a vicious act could ever be truly rehabilitated. Steven's mother remained the voice most people listened to. In interviews, she did not rage. She did not accuse. She asked only that people remember her son, not just the horror of his death, but the simplicity of his life. She spoke of his kindness, his eagerness to help, his desire for friendship. She asked that the community remember that behind every headline and every court ruling was a boy who wanted to live. In the years following the murder, Carl Junction had already taken steps to reckon with the trauma. Schools introduced peer support programs. Churches organized youth outreach groups. Mental health services were brought into classrooms, and teachers received training to recognize behavioral warning signs. These were small changes, but they were permanent. The memory of what had happened shaped how the town raised its next generation. Nationally, the case remained emblematic of a specific cultural moment. It was often invoked as part of the Satanic Panic, the wave of fear in the 1980s and early 1990s that painted teenagers who read dark literature or listened to heavy metal as potential cultists. In that climate, the murder of Steven Newberry was seen by many as proof that the panic was justified. Here were three boys immersed in satanic imagery who had carried out a ritualistic killing. But as time passed, scholars, journalists, and legal experts revisited the case with more nuance. They argued that while satanic symbols were used by the perpetrators, the real forces at play were peer pressure, mental illness, and emotional disconnection. The crime was not rooted in theology. It was rooted in isolation. In that sense, the murder became a cautionary tale not about religion, but about the dangers of letting struggling teenagers fall through the cracks. Academics wrote about the case in textbooks on criminology, adolescent psychology, and juvenile justice. It appeared in documentaries and podcasts, not as a simple story of evil, but as a tragic intersection of fantasy and reality. The trials became case studies in how confessions are evaluated, how youth are sentenced, and how courts weigh rehabilitation against punishment. The story evolved, the people involved grew older, but the meaning of what happened in 1987 never disappeared. At the heart of this story is Steven Newberry. He was 19 when he was killed. He never made it to 20. He had no criminal record, no record of violence, no hidden agenda. His greatest mistake was trusting people who did not deserve it. He was not weak, he was not naive, he was human. His murder shattered his family and sent shockwaves through his community. But it also forced people to ask hard questions about justice, forgiveness, and the human capacity for both violence and redemption. His death sparked reforms, inspired dialogue, and became a symbol for what can happen when the need to belong is manipulated by those with darker intentions. Today, there is no statue for Steven, no official plaque in Carl Junction to mark the place where he died. But his story has not been forgotten. It lives in the court archives, in the classrooms where his case is taught, and in the memories of those who continue to say his name. More than 35 years later, Steven Newberry's life still teaches. It teaches about the dangers of silence, the importance of vigilance, and the need for compassion, not just for victims, but for the lost and the angry before they become perpetrators. This story should never have needed to be told, but because it happened, we are left with a duty. To tell it fully, to tell it honestly, and to ensure that the darkness of that December night remains a lesson, not a legacy.